Hi everyone, this is Thomas Blawn, and I'm making this recording about a very good friend of mine who just passed away a week ago Friday. His name was Yonas Deressa. He was from Ethiopia, and I met him in 1967, long time ago, at Pace College in New York City, and in the lower part of Manhattan Island. I had just started college as a freshman, and so had he. He was older than I. He was about 25, and I was 17. He would come into math class, usually a little late every day, and he was sort of an interesting looking fellow. And I was drawn to him because I said, you know, this is a fellow that I have to meet. He was kind of on the quiet side. And, of course, a little attention was drawn to him, even though he tried to come into the classroom without drawing attention to himself. Since he came in a little late almost every day, I wondered why he was doing that. And then quite frequently he would go and talk to the professor, a young mathematician professor, at the end of class. So one day I decided I would join them. And they were talking about politics. And I was interested in politics. It was a time of turmoil in the United States of America. Civil rights was in its heyday, and so was the struggle against the war in Vietnam. And so there was a lot to talk about. So I joined them. And the three of us decided one time to take our conversation after class down to a coffee shop. And we did that a number of times. Well, one day, this professor, whose name was Professor Talameri, he left us, and Yonas and I were standing outside the coffee shop, and I had just become very interested in the conversation. It was stuff I'd never heard about. And Yonas at the time was pretty radical, from Africa, and he was telling me things and educating me about things I'd never heard about. And coming from a suburban New York neighborhood out in Long Island, I had led a fairly sheltered, typical young teenager suburban life, and you know, loyal to America and believing that America was the best country in the world and so on. And I really wasn't aware of some of the things that the country was doing in Vietnam and so on. And so I said to him after our second or third coffee shop meeting, you know, I really want to be your friend. And coming from Ethiopia, he was kind of intrigued by that, because Ethiopians are a little bit more reserved than that, and not so forthright or forthcoming when it comes to expressing an emotion like that. And so he took it to heart, and he was older and more educated, and he saw that I had a desire to learn and absorb new information. So he took it upon himself to recommend books to me. And the books he recommended to me I found so interesting. Historical, political, current events, and I read quite a few books within the first couple of weeks of him recommending those books to me, and he was lending them to me, so I'd read one and give it back, and read one and give it back, and that intrigued him, that I was absorbing information so fast. So we became fast friends. And as I read, and we discussed the books that we read, others came into our group. He was dating a girl from America by the name of Sherry Broman from Colorado, and she was a student studying early childhood education in Manhattan. He also had a cousin, Fanuel, an Ethiopian, that became part of our study group, and an American by the name of Bobby Russo. So there was the five of us, that was the core group, that followed Yonas into the world of education and intellectualism and reading. And over the course of the next few years, as we worked our way through college, Yonas was, I often said, was like our Socrates, and we were his students on the hill. And we would take on whole subjects and whole authors, whether it be psychology or sociology or economics. And Yonas would have us read the original works of authors like Erich Fromm and Karen Horney and Catherine Sullivan and Freud, C. Wright Mills in sociology. We read the original works of Marx and Engels, and he would even recommend the counter arguments, like an author like Karl Popper, who wrote a series of books called I believe it was called The Open Society. And we would read these books and discuss it, and sometimes stay up till dawn, sitting around. He liked his scotch and beer, and we would sit around and smoke cigarettes and drink scotch and till the sun came up, sometimes discussing issues, and he would conduct these conversations as debates and rhetoric, and we would have to defend our positions and beliefs back and forth. And as a result, we got educated very, very fast. He was educating us in a manner that was kind of old school, where you would sit with a teacher and actually read for the teacher and then discuss and learn your topics that way. It was an incredible education as fast as we moved along. Some funny things happened along the way too, because I was good at math and Yonas was good in English, even though his accent was a little bit strong. But his English was very good, his writing was very good, and we would, so we decided through that first year in college that I could help him with math and he could help me with English. Well, one time we were sitting in the math class and the professor asked us what we were doing to improve Jonas's math and so on. I said, well, when the class was listening, I said, I help him with his math and he helps me with my English. Well, of course, everybody thought that was hilarious, and the class laughed at us. But indeed, Yonas was quite a good writer. I also found out why he was coming into class late, because he had a job in which he was a translator at the United Nations. He was translating speeches and stuff that were done at the United Nations in English or other languages, and he was translating that into Ethiopian to be broadcast back to his home country of Ethiopia. So he would work very, very hard and then run to go to our evening math class. The core group, Sherry, Bobby, Fanwell, we all progressed. It was like we had done PhD work in the 4 years that we were all in college at the same time. And he was such a demanding sort of fellow we had to have intellectual rigor and so on. That was a period in my life of tremendous growth, and I know the others that were associated with him grew fast also. You know, unfortunately, in many regards, but not necessarily at the end of the day, Yonas was at that time a committed Marxist, and that's the direction he led us in. And so he led us towards Marxism and atheism, but later in life he rectified that for most of us. And he was on a quest. Yonas was on a quest. He believed very much in trying to do good for humanity and for his fellow citizens and people. He was very, very interested in the future of Ethiopia and what would happen with their folks. And of course, at the time, you know, Ethiopia was ruled by an emperor, Haile Selassie, and the systems there, the sociological and economic systems, were very feudal in nature, very middle age in nature. And of course, looking back in history now, one would have to say that life under Haile Selassie was much better than life under his successors, which turned out to be Marxist totalitarians sponsored by either the Soviet Union or the Chinese. But at the time, we were radicals, and we did some radical things together, all of us, sometimes demonstrating and going to demonstrations. I must tell you that the influence he exercised in my life was enormous. He changed my life in ways that I'm going to try to explain to you. And the person that I became was very much influenced by Yonas Deressa and his travels, because he did not stop growing. He did not get stuck at one juncture. He was a searcher. He believed very strong in integrity and truth, and he was searching not only for himself, but he was searching for the truth, what would set his people free. So our motivations, we felt, for having been at one time Marxists, was that we believed actually in the ideal of it, which was that everybody would be treated equally and everybody would have a fair share, and society would not have huge income gaps, and we were really motivated by our desire to do good for people. But there are fundamental flaws in the system because of the fundamental flaws that exist within humanity. And we learned later that these systems do not work. They lead to totalitarianism, oppression, and some of the most grotesque, inhuman actions took place in the 20th century and still continue to this day in the 21st century under the communist totalitarian regimes. Now, I would like to tell you some of the things that I did in life because Yonas urged me on to it. In 1969, there was an opportunity to go to Cuba with 700 other crazy Americans to cut sugarcane for Fidel, who that year was trying to harvest 10 million tons of sugarcane, a milestone. And so we went there, and I got to see Cuba for 11 weeks, and I wouldn't have gone if it wasn't for Yonas Deressa. And as a matter of fact, while we were there, Fidel came and addressed the whole group and spoke for 4 hours. So I got to actually hear Fidel Castro, as a much younger man, speak for quite some long time. When I finished college, Yonas said to me, "You know, Tom, you're young, you're only 21. Maybe you should take a year off and go learn a language so you're not doing nothing, and then when you come back you can go to graduate school," which I wanted to do. So because of Jonas's urging, I took a year off, went to Germany, learned the German language, and it was one of the greatest years of my life, and I truly have that year's worth of memories and experiences, and the fact that I speak German fluently, because of Yonas Deressa. I just owe him so much. Many things like this in my life happened because of Yonas Deressa. When I came back from Germany, he was growing, and he was going beyond where he had been. By that time already, he was looking into other things, and when I was age 23, Yonas decided that he was going to experiment and get involved in a type of therapy that was pioneered by Wilhelm Reich, a school of therapy which was called organ therapy. And Yonas successfully got himself accepted as a patient by a world-renowned orgonomist, they were called, Dr. Baker. And he worked for him for many years to try and free himself up from some of what they called character structure, and he changed very rapidly as a result of that. And I followed him into that type of therapy, although not with Dr. Baker, with another doctor. I did 11 years of therapy and freed myself up from a lot of childhood trauma. And that growing took place in my life because of Yonas Deressa and what he was doing and what he urged me. And it wasn't shortly after that that Yonas ditched Marxism, although he didn't ditch atheism yet, but he ditched Marxism in about 1975 when he started reading books like Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, and Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, and George Orwell's, what was it called? Not Animal House, that was the movie. There was George Orwell wrote 1984, and then he wrote another one about communism. That was very startling. One of the interesting things I did when I went to Germany, I should have added this before, was live in West Berlin and travel to East Berlin, and I got to see communism firsthand, and it was really kind of shocking. East Berlin was like a fortress, and people couldn't leave it. Although we could go visit it, the East Germans could not leave. And West Berlin was a modern city of neon lights and bustle and hustle and businesses, and you go over to East Berlin, and the rubble from World War II was still there to be found. And when you walked out of the subway, the checkpoint that you went through to get your passport checked and to get into East Germany and East Berlin, you walked out of the subway and there were armed guards with AK-47s marching around. And of course the Berlin Wall, which you traveled over in an elevated, what we would call an elevated subway, because after it crossed the wall it would go underground. The 100 or 200 yards or so of no man's land was just startling. It was incredible. Machine gun nests and dogs and mining and all these obstructions that the communists had to put up to keep their people within the confines of their portion of the city, because everybody would have left. The opportunities were so much greater on the western side for work and progress and education. So Jonas pretty much ditched Marxism and communism and decided, another great book that we read, that he recommended to me and I read, was Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And of course you know that what's postulated in there is that individualism is really what makes a society go, and the profit motive is what really makes a society go, and that the communist idea that everyone would be equal really destroys people's desire to get ahead, because you can't get ahead. There's no incentive to get ahead. So what really makes a society prosper and grow, according to these works, was individualism and the profit motive. And that Jonas then adopted. And as a matter of fact, that changed my life again, because at age 25, after reading these books and realizing that the best contribution I could make to society was to work hard and better myself and grow businesses and employ people and be an innovator and a creator, an entrepreneur. And so that's the direction I went in. But that was a result of Jonas changing his perspective. And in this video you'll see two clips of him, one in 1986 when he spoke to the United States Forum for Ethics and Public Policy, and then again and he spoke about the Ethiopian famine and what caused it, and then you'll see him again in 1991 where he spoke for 4 minutes in a testimony to the United States Congress. And you can see that the nature of his thinking had changed, that the United States was now no longer the pariah, but that the United States was a place to be admired because of its Constitution and its founding documents. Not that he didn't realize that in some respects the society was flawed and had problems, you know, like originally having slavery and so on, which we had to fight a civil war to get rid of. But he recognized that if Ethiopia were to adopt a constitution like the United States and a federal government, where there were states representing regions, and then these regional governments represented by a federal government, where there was the rule of law and there were the rights of private property, so that if you worked hard and you acquired things, you could get to keep them. Now, of course, if you look at those videos that I was telling you, well, you'll see those videos in this production that we're doing, you'll see that he attributed the famine in Ethiopia mainly to the what the Marxists and Communists had done to the peasants and so-called rich peasants by stealing their seed stock so that they couldn't plant. There was always periods in Ethiopian farming that were better than others, and that's true everywhere in the world. Some years of better weather for farming and not. And the farmers, ancient society like Ethiopia, knew that they had to put seed away and food away for the bad years when they were having good years. And of course, when the communist armies would march into these hamlets and find farmers that had quote unquote more than they needed, the armies would steal the stuff, and as a result, there wasn't the food there to feed the animals the next year if there was a drought. And so you'll see this explained more in these YouTubes from Yonas.
Ethiopians have a deep regard for the United States, not just because of its role in relieving famine, but because it stands as the finest example of the kind of society we wish to emulate. Like the people of Eastern Europe, who read aloud your Declaration of Independence during their freedom demonstrations last year, the words of that magnificent document strike a deep chord in the hearts of Ethiopians. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is why Ethiopians welcomed American efforts to end the 17-year-old long civil war between Mengistu and various guerrilla movements by sponsoring talks in London beginning last May 27. Traditionally, Ethiopia's farmers have saved food in good years for the bad seasons that they know are bound to come. But according to the communist regime in Addis Ababa, saving food from good years has been called hoarding and has led inexorably to mass executions. Saving money from past harvests and reinvesting for more future production of food is called capitalist accumulation and a crime against the people.
Now, why am I recording all of this? Because I want the Ethiopians that watch this and Jonas's relatives, whether it be nieces and nephews or whatever. I know the families in Ethiopia are extended, and I knew a lot of Ethiopians when we were living closer together, when he lived in New York and I lived in New York. In the 80s, he moved to Washington, D.C., and as a result, we didn't see one another as much, but we talked on the phone. And he continued to help me throughout my entire life and career, right till the day that he passed. He was an inspiration to me and to many other people, and I know to many Ethiopians. He did radio shows, and he did writings, and Let me just tell you one little example of when he was working with his brother Deressa during the 1980s, when they were trying to fight the communists, when there was guerrilla warfare really going on in Ethiopia against the Marxists. Yonas was here in the Washington, D.C. lobbying, trying to raise money, and he had a knack for meeting the most interesting people, and he had become friends somehow with the female publisher and owner of the New York Times, Claire Booth Luce. And he asked Claire Booth Luce to help him in Deressa, and Claire Booth Luce was a friend of Nancy Reagan. So Claire Booth asked Yonas, how can we help you? And he said, well, you can get us arms and money. And Claire Booth Luce spoke to Nancy Reagan about it. Nancy Reagan spoke to the President of the United States about it. And of course, President Reagan was trying to tear down communism, and one of his main strategies was to help fund freedom fighters all across the whole globe that was fighting the Soviet Union in various places like Afghanistan and Ethiopia and Nicaragua and places like that. And of course the Reagan policy was, if the United States of America could up the ante on the Soviet Union, their system, which was nearly bankrupt, would become bankrupt and crash. And that's what happened. And actually Ethiopia was part of that struggle. Yonas, actually Ronald Reagan instructed his CIA director, Jesse Helms, to have a meeting with Yonas, and Yonas had a personal meeting with Jesse Helms, and out of the CIA budget, Ethiopia received monies to help wage the struggle against the communists that were destroying the country, and to this day have done almost irreparable damage to the country of Ethiopia. And Yonas accomplished that with Deressa. Quite something for someone that perhaps the world will never hear of. Unfortunately, his life was cut short. Honestly, folks, I thought Yonas Deressa would be like the George Washington of Ethiopia. What George Washington was to the United States, I thought Yonas had the character for that. He was honest. He was not self-serving. He was a great speaker. He was a terrific motivator. And you can see that from the clips of his speaking. And I know he had returned to Ethiopia sometime in the 90s and did a radio interview, and they held him there for 6 weeks because they were so excited about the things that he was saying. And he wasn't ethnocentric in any way, although I believe that his ethnic background was Oromo. He didn't believe in that the ethnic thing was all that important, although reality, he didn't think it was important. He thought that with a federation, all Ethiopians could work together to free their country, to write a constitution, to realize prosperity. He told me very early on that Ethiopia was basically the breadbasket of East Africa, that the lands were very fertile and the people were very hard-working, and they produced way more food than they could consume themselves, and so they were exporters of coffee and other things. He also told me a lot about the history of Ethiopia, the emperors whose names I know, Menelik and so on, and he told me so much about Ethiopia that I can't wait to go visit there. And of course his brother Yonas Deressa has invited me to do that, and I will do that. One day you will see me, little old Tom Blawn, in Ethiopia. I've used so many of his little anecdotes and things that he told me through life. One of the things he used to say to somebody that he was trying to help was that the mind was like an unsharpened pencil that you just had to sharpen. And you sharpen it by reading and writing and discussing. And we did those very things. Because of Yonas Deressa, actually, I married my first wife And it was his help in that relationship that made that relationship happen. So frankly, for those of you who are listening to this, I have two sons, 31 and 28 years old, and if it wasn't for Yonas Deressa, in all likelihood, that probably would not have happened. He helped me with getting my job. I had to go through a testing, and I asked Yonas to help me prepare for it. And so we would spend a whole day together just discussing things of the right way to respond to the exam that I had to go through, and frankly, I probably would not have made it without him. As we were growing and learning new things and growing personally and intellectually and so on, and Yonas never stopped growing and never stopped learning. He had an insatiable appetite for learning and reading. I'd estimate that Yonas read somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 books easily. He had a voracious appetite for reading, and geez, what a great sense of humor too. Despite being such a serious fellow, he had a great sense of humor. Now, we had an interesting thing happen, he and I, more or less at the same time, because we had remained, even though we had ditched Marxism, we had remained atheists for a lot longer. And around 1990 or 91, thereabouts, the third brother of the four brothers, there was Solomon Deressa, Blawn Deressa, Deressa, and Yonas. Well, Deressa got sick with cancer, and by this time Yonas was beginning to believe in God again, and he had a very interesting thing happen to him. And in a chapel in Little Rock, Arkansas, he was praying for his brother's life, which was in jeopardy. And he was in the chapel in the hospital where Deressa was, and he was praying very, very hard. He told me he was praying like this with his hand on his forehead and asking God for mercy on Deressa. And actually, Jesus entered the back of the chapel, according to Yonas, and asked Yonas directly. Yonas looked behind him because he felt like a presence back there, and Jesus was standing there, and Jesus said, "State thy case." And Yonas stated to Jesus, "I don't want my brother to die of cancer." Now, it was the very next day or the day after that Deressa's cancer actually went into remission. And Deressa passed away shortly thereafter, but not from cancer. He passed away from pneumonia. And I always remember this as a lesson. When you pray, you need to be very specific about what you ask God for, because Yonas asked specifically, "I don't want my brother to die from cancer," but he really didn't ask. He didn't really ask for the right thing. He didn't want his brother to die then. He wanted his brother to have a much longer life. Deressa was doing good things for Ethiopia, raising money for the freedom fighters and so on, and it would have been a good thing if he had continued on in life to help his country that way. So I always took that as a lesson after that, that when you pray, make sure you know be specific about what you're praying for. I have to tell you that at the very same time I had a very intense spiritual experience, only months after Yonas had his, and I was still an atheist, and geez, I had lost my job, and I thought it was a tragedy, and I lay awake at night praying, and not praying, but just thinking. I wasn't praying at that time because I didn't think there was anybody to pray to, but I was 42 years old at the time, and I lost my job, and this was a tragedy. The economy wasn't good, and what was I going to do? I had 2 little kids at home and a wife and a mortgage and all that. So I reasoned my way to God. I just thought, well, I started counting on a scale, like you would weigh a scale, the good things that had happened to me in life and the bad things that had happened to me in life. And when I thought about who was responsible for the good things, and I thought about who was responsible for the bad things, Well, it occurred to me that the bad things, I was responsible for most of them, my decisions and my choices, and the good things that had come in my life were really, God was responsible for them. And well, I didn't say God at the moment, but I thought, well, somebody else is responsible for them because I wasn't. I had good health, and my wife had good health, and my kids had good health, and my parents had good health, and so on and so forth. And you know, my kids were not born with disabilities and so on. And I started to think, well, all these good things that have happened to me, I wasn't responsible for, and the bad things I was. So there must be somebody out there blessing me. And at that instant, I said, well, thank you, God. Well, I saw a blinding white light come, and it congealed down into a white face with a beard, and smiled at me, and I felt like I had been welcomed home to God, that he was just waiting for me to talk to him. And I was so confused right after that, and Yonas helped me with that too. It wasn't a few days after that, I was so confused and really troubled. I mean, here I was, an atheist of 23 years, and now I'm thinking I'm speaking with God. and I guess I was, but it was so, so incredible a story. And so I called Yonas up and I said, Yonas, do you believe in God? And he said, yes, of course. And I said, well, I just had this incredible experience, and I explained it to him, and then he told me about his experience in the chapel in Little Rock, and here were two friends that we were friends for so long and had shared so much, and then here we were both having this spiritual experience at the same time, and we continued to grow in the spirit and in our spiritual lives, and shared these experiences right up until the time that Yonas passed away. And I know, I want you to know, all of you that have grieved for his loss, I want you all to know that there's no doubt in my mind that we'll see one another, and you'll see your relatives that have passed away. You'll celebrate with them in heaven, and it's particularly important that you grasp that, and that you come to the realization of even how you get to heaven, because Yonas believed very, very strongly in the truth of the Bible, particularly the New Testament. He prayed like crazy to whom he called his Lord and Master, Jesus Christ. And he called God his Heavenly Father, and he prayed. His prayers were so intense and so beautiful. Sometimes he would tell me how he prayed. He meditated a lot the last 20 years, and there was nothing that he wanted more than to experience a oneness with God, which is man's eternal quest, really. Our loneliness and our the emptiness that we are in is in our heart, that we try to replace with so many other things, material things, or drinking or drugs or whatever, really comes from our desire to feel that oneness with our Heavenly Father. And when you can feel that oneness, which you may never really ultimately feel on this planet, on this earth, until you pass on, and then you go on to glory in heaven. And that's where you'll experience that in a tremendous glory. For those of you who have questions about this and doubts, I recommend two books very, very heavily. They just made it into a movie. It's called Heaven is Real, about a little boy's experience with a near-death experience. And another one, a neuroscientist wrote a book, Proof of Heaven. I recommend those two books for anyone listening to this very heavily. You should to gain the conviction that it's not a fictional account. And I explain to atheists when I can, when they'll listen, that the bet they're making, you have to have a lot of faith to make their bet, because they're betting that there's nothing beyond this life. And so they're betting their eternal soul. And you and I and those of us who believe, well, we're betting otherwise. We're betting that we do have an eternal soul and that Jesus was correct, that he is the way, the truth, and the light, and that we can come to the Father through him, and that if we believe in him, we will ascend, we will go to heaven when we pass on from here. And that's the bet we're making. Now, if we're wrong, well, we really haven't lost anything. But if the atheists are wrong, well, they've lost everything. Think about it. Their eternal soul lost forever and ever. Well, that's what Yonas believed the last 22 years of his life, and he helped me to believe. Folks, I couldn't tell you what a tremendous loss it is to Ethiopia that he's still not here. His dream was to go back, help his people to create that democratic republic, a federalist based on a federal organization like we have here, that the economy would spark and people would experience prosperity, that he could help, if he had gone back to Ethiopia, help people to understand the things he helped me to understand, and many other folks who he helped also. I tell my wife all the time when I speak about Yonas, because I'm married to it's my second wife, and she's a good Christian, and she helped me come to Christ. And I tell her all the time, that Yonas was a tremendous influence, and she would say, well, but I'm the one who got you to come to Christ. And I would say, yeah, it's true, you helped, but I wouldn't be the man today if it wasn't for Yonas Deressa. He was my brother. He said, frankly, I don't think anybody knew Yonas better than I did. Well, I know that for a fact that nobody knew Yonas better than I did, because we grew together, we learned together, we shared our intimate experiences and feelings in a way that most people don't have a friend like that, or maybe one or two in your life where you have a friend like that. I'm so grieved by the fact that he's gone from this planet, from Earth. I'm grieved by the fact that he didn't get to realize his dream of freeing Ethiopia. I always thought that he'd be like George Washington and go back and not only help Ethiopia free itself, change, but that Ethiopia would then become a spark to the rest of Africa, that people could see how they could improve their lives and society, how they could set up their society in a manner in which the individual was honored and treasured and had rights and could vote for a representative government and grow and prosper and feed their families and educate their children and be free of diseases that just shouldn't exist any longer. The treatments exist to eradicate many of the diseases that still exist in Africa. In other words, modernize the whole continent. And I thought that, frankly, he would be one of the people, if not a primary person, to go back there and send that spark through that continent, through Ethiopia. It's still possible. And I'm making this recording to go out to your country, Ethiopia, so that you'll know what a fabulous person he was. He never had a lot. He never made a lot of money. But the wealth that he created within folks like me and others who he taught and gave to, the wealth he created in himself, in self-development. He was a tremendous intellect, a great writer, a great speaker. And I lament the fact that he did not get to realize his dream of going home to the country he loved. He loved Ethiopia, but he also loved America. He adopted America. He lived here from the age of about 24 till he passed at almost 71 years of age. And he's buried here in Minneapolis, where there are so many Ethiopians. I hope this helps all of you to understand a legacy that I wished he had left behind. I wished I had wanted him to do this recording himself, and when I knew that he was very, very sick, I was going to make arrangements for that. And by a convergence of accidents, he lost his cell phone. I didn't know where to get a hold of him. I couldn't get to him before he had become very, very sick and was no longer able really to speak much. And towards the end, it was awful. I must tell you, any of you that are seeing or hearing this, his illness was caused by smoking. And if you're still smoking, give it up. You owe it to your family. You owe it to your kids, your grandchildren. You owe it to your friends. Give it up. Yonas did give up smoking, and that's an interesting story, so I'd like to tell it to you. He was a chain smoker and smoked 2 to 3 packs of Kent cigarettes every day, lighting one to the other. And I appreciate the addiction that smoking is. Nicotine is one of the worst addictive products there are. It's worse than heroin. That's why so many people find it so hard to quit. But Yonas had a dream. Somewhere in the middle or late 1990s, his brother Deressa appeared to him in a dream. Now Deressa had passed on, as I told you. And his brother Deressa delivered a message to him from God himself. And Yonas told me about this dream. And Deressa said to him point blank, "The Lord wants you to quit smoking." Well, he woke up from the dream and remembered it, because it was so startling to get a visit from your brother who had passed away. And so Yonas, he actually quit. He told me it was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. And I'd quit smoking when I was 28, many years before him. So I know it's not easy. But Yonas said it was the hardest thing he had ever done. Years before he had quit drinking. He had been a heavy drinker and smoker. And so he quit the smoking maybe 15 years, 14 years before he passed away, but the damage had been done to his lungs. And you know, you can have lung cancer. I looked it up. You can have lung cancer and not even know it for 3 to 5 years. And if it's not detected, then it spreads very fast. That's what I read recently, and that's what happened to Yonas. It went into his brain and liver, and from diagnosis to passing away, it was 6 very short weeks. I did get to see him. He knew I was there, although we couldn't really have much of a conversation. And I got to thank him for all he had done for me. And I'm taking this time to make this recording because I want him immortalized in this recording. I want it there for posterity. What a guy. He was amazing. And all of you who lost him should know how amazing he was. To help a little young white kid from Long Island, New York, grow and develop in the way he helped me. I am eternally grateful for having known him. And I wish you had all known him as I did. It was a life well led in many ways, because what's the most important thing in life? Developing yourself, realizing God's potential for you. And Yonas tried to do that. And he tried to get others to do that for themselves. That when we waste our talents and we waste the gifts that God give us, it's not right. And that's what Yonas believed. And he spent the last 20 years trying to develop spiritually and intellectually so he could be all that he could be. And he had a very nice, simple burial and funeral. He passed in his sleep. He was not suffering at the very end. I wasn't there, but Brahana had made it from Ethiopia, his brother, to say goodbye, and I think Yonas waited for him to come. I think Yonas waited for me to get there. And I'd gotten there a few days before, and then I had to come back to Florida where I live, and Brahana got there on Wednesday night, saw his brother on Thursday, and Yonas passed on that Friday in his sleep at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll post some pictures of the funeral, and he was buried in a simple pine box. His body was buried in a simple pine box, and it's a beautiful cemetery where he is in Minneapolis. And I was so startled when I went there because the site that he was going to be buried in was probably the nicest site in the entire cemetery, in my opinion, because it was under this most beautiful, full oak tree, which you'll see pictures of. And so that's where his body rests. And I know he's celebrating in heaven and exploring the bounty that is in heaven, because according to that book I told you about, Heaven is Real. Heaven has lots and lots of things to do. So you're not going to be bored if you get to heaven. It's going to be exciting and interesting, and we're going to be doing things that we never dreamed imaginable, because we live here in a material world and we get mesmerized by our 5 senses and the possibilities of this material world. But the spiritual world is much more bountiful and varied, and Jesus said in the Bible, my Father's home has many mansions, which means that there's just variety all over the place in heaven, and you should know that when we get there. I thank God that I knew Yonas Deressa as a friend and a brother, and I wish you all could have known him as I did. He had a big heart, an insatiable appetite for knowledge, and he wanted nothing more for Ethiopia that it become free and prosper. That's what he wanted.